Hello. Okay. Is this a good level to stand at? Awesome. Yeah, I'd just like to mention that before I set up here, the tech guys had to ask me if I knew how to use Windows. It's that sort of festival. So, yeah, I'm going to be talking about shape change in nature and ways that we as humans can seek to emulate it, learn from it, and use some of those tricks. So if you don't want to hear about flowers that throw their seeds meters, sea creatures that change shape, or 3D printers that print things that assemble themselves, leave now, it's fine. I won't take it personally. And my name is Scary. I prefer to be known by that, but if you want to look at my professional work, you'll need to use the name under which they pay me, and that's Kate Oliver. And there's my Twitter handle, so if you want to heckle me throughout the show, that's how you do it. So I work in shape change, and basically this consists of spending most of my days looking enviously at pine cones and wishing I could do what they do. And why would I be envious of such a simple item? Well, the pine cone, it opens when it's dry to disperse its seeds, but it can close when it's wet to keep its seeds safe and prevent them from rotting. It does all this with no centralized control. It's just distributed through the pine cone, which is made of biodegradable materials. It works with no power. It can be dropped from the tree and still work with no adverse effects. And it's a pretty cool piece of tech for something that is incredibly simple. And what are these aspects that we'd like to get? Well, if you were to build a synthetic pine cone, you'd need something that would detect moisture, then some way of transmitting what that level was to some sort of logic that would then decide what action to take based on that, then transmit that action to some sort of actuator. And that's 5 things that could go wrong or be interrupted. That's 5 things that could be hacked. It's 5 things that take energy. It's 5 things that maybe need to be connected to a grid. I've mentioned that it's responsive, which is something that I'll come to in the next section about why I think that's a really necessary thing. But pine cones are also really resilient because if you snap off half the scales or even most of one scale, it will still work. And if you compare that to my 5-element synthetic setup, you just can't get equivalent performance. And what could we do if we could harness something as good as the humble pine cone? So I think this is the future, and that's why I work in it. And because it's the future, there aren't many photos of it yet. So I'm just sort of going to sketch some ideas at you, and I leave you to imagine a lot of this for yourself. So one of the major uses, I think, is environmental. If we're talking about reacting to what's going on around you, why not have an umbrella that only opens when the sun is shining? Why not have a vent that automatically opens when the temperature gets over a certain amount? This is a wall designed by architects at the University of Stuttgart working with computer scientists, and it opens when it's sunny and warm to let a breeze through, and then it closes when it's wet to provide shelter. And this is all automatic. There's no control needed, and this would survive a car driving through it, which, again, I challenge you to do with actuators. Medical applications. A lot of the time we want to insert something into somebody as a replacement for what's broken. That would work a lot better if we could have it fold up and then, when it's inserted, and then deploy inside the body. That would mean a lot less trauma at the insert site, a lot less healing time. Robots, they're good, aren't they? So it would be nice if we had a wider variety of actuators and sensors to use with robots. At the moment, we're looking at a very kind of stiff model for elements that robots are made out of, something that's softer and more human compatible, something that's less binary, something that has more intelligence and reactivity built in would give a lot more options for robot design. They could use it for products. If you imagine a spanner that changes size depending on the frequency of light that you hit it with, you need a lot fewer spanners. In science, we'd like to have basically all of this and more. So it would be really nice if we could buy all our stuff flat-packed and then it would build itself instead of us having to do it. We could have a microscope that focused a lens that increased its focusing power depending on the amount of light that was hitting it. There's a lot of things that are possible, and all of these things that I've mentioned are theoretically possible now. And this is just the start of expanding a design space that shape-changing materials could let us access. So I'm going to do a bit of a review of natural aspects of shape change that we'd basically like to ogle, then talk about aspects of it that we've successfully managed to copy, and then afterwards I'd like to throw the throw the field open to you guys and highlight some areas that I think that makers and hobbyists can really contribute to shape-changing materials, because you've done an awful lot for loads of other fields, and I'd like to start a discussion about this. So, ogling. These are pictures of cool, shape-changing natural things. And I don't really place these here to show you new things. I place them here to kind of suggest some stuff that you might want to go and look up on your own, because you'll basically get a much better idea of it if you have the time to sit and look at it on your own. But I've got here, will this video play? No, this video will not play. Sorry, I don't know how to go back. There we go. So this is a plant that deploys itself. There's an octopus, which in its uniquely creepy way completely changes its texture of its skin. Look at those little spikes. That is not natural. That's not normal. This is a Cornish mallow, which is a fairly common plant, but it's actually got analog logic encoded in its leaves that enables the leaves to turn and keep themselves at 90 degrees to the sun to avoid overheating. And this is work that's ongoing at the University of Bristol, where I'm studying. And down at the bottom here, the little mushroom cloud, that's actually a sphagnum moss deploying a cloud of spores. So there's a lot that nature can do. Let's look at how it does it. General principle of plant shape change. Plants are basically water. They basically accept more water or squeeze out more water. But to do more interesting things than that, to avoid just basically getting bigger and getting smaller, they have cellulose, which is laid into the plant cells. So I've got a sketch here of kind of little cells as blocks, and they've got the cellulose laid in different directions. And the direction that the cellulose is laid in, the plant can't expand because the cellulose is pretty tough. However, it can move the cellulose fibers further apart, so it can expand in the other direction. And from this really simple principle of aligned bits of cellulose and swelling, you can build systems that bend, and you can build hinges, which I've got sketched in the bottom. And this bending is basically how pine cones work, and this hinge is basically a sketch of how we could start to build up the sort of things that we think of in human-centric context. Can plants do more than that? Sure they can. So this is a plant called a filary, which is native to the Mediterranean. It's about this big, and it manages to fire its own seeds 0.5 meter. Using just the power of it drying out in the sun. And it does this because it's got those cellulose alignments, like I was talking about, and the cellulose in the cells is aligned. That's what you see in the bottom picture here. That's a scanning electron microscope image of the alignment of the fibers. That makes the cells tilt. The cells then make the fibers they're in tilt and spiral. Then the spirals come together to make more spirals. And as they dry out, they contract and wind the spiral tighter until the spiral becomes so tight that the material isn't strong enough to hold up against its own pressure. And it snaps and launches that seed 1 meter away, and thus enables the plant to spread over a wider range. So from the simple act of contraction, we've gone to ballistics. And how good is that compared to what humans can do? Pretty good. So I did these rough calculations, and they're based on energy equivalent in the volume. So you've got a bit of a penalty because it has to fire itself. So if it's pretty heavy, it needs more energy to get itself moving, but then it can store more energy. So it's a bit of a trade-off. But you can see here that, no, I can't do a pointer. You'll just have to sort of work with it. Filary can fire itself in the absence of drag, because all these equations are easier if you pretend you're in a vacuum. So in the absence of drag, filary can fire itself 2.5 meters. That's a lot better than a mussel. So from this, we learned that if plants were made of meat, they wouldn't work. We have yew wood, which is one of the best woods in terms of energy for weight, which is why it was such a boon to archers. We learned that shape memory alloy is really good, but shape memory polymers, we'll come back to them later, are much better. That theoretically carbon nanotubes would be amazing, but in practice they're outdone by spiders. So the lesson we are learning here is that on this kind of, rather artificial metric I've just slammed together because I wanted a graph of like ballistics, that human materials are not up to the scratch of what can be done in the natural world yet, and there's a lot of potential for expansion. And this is part of a paper I've got submitting at the moment. Can plants be fast? Yes, they can be fast. So this is a Venus flytrap. And Venus flytraps work by having that really gentle swelling motion, and they have a really gentle gradual motion, but they apply it really cunningly. So they've got a structure which flips between concave and convex. You can see it on the bottom of the drawing here. And it's like those little rubber things that you used to get in cereal boxes when you were a kid. I don't know if anyone else had those. Like it's just a little cap, and then you push your thumb on it, turn it inside out, and then it pops and unleashes all that stored energy in the rubber and flies into the air. Yeah, so you've got basically a small swelling applied to a point where it's just balanced on the edge of being between two states. And that small push is enough to flip it between two states and release a lot of energy fast enough that this happens in 100 microseconds. Milliseconds, sorry, order of magnitude. Several orders of magnitude. But it's quick enough to catch a fly is my major point. So that's plants. Let's have a little chat about animals. So these are the general layout of mussels, our mussels, and indeed mussels. So this is two lots of interlinked fibers, and the blue ones here are actin, and the red ones are myosin, and they're kind of interlocking, and what happens is that when calcium is released, the myosin sort of climbs its way along the actin, sort of cinching it in, and then the two things slide together and the general volume decreases. Now, what's really interesting here is that we do that temporarily and we need to keep feeding those mussels to keep that reaction going. But mussels and clams, they use a big muscle to hold their shell shut to keep their entire body, soft body, protected against every predator out there that wants to eat them. And they're able to exert 5 times more power than our mussels are, and they can just lock them and leave them like that for days. It's not entirely known, the mechanism of how they do this, but it seems like they make temporary bonds between these actin and myosin, so while we need to keep the myosin clawing along the actin, they can just put a lock on it and basically come back later. So this is a really interesting model for low energy use and an idea of how we might want to steal this idea for our own thoughts. And finally, this is a sea cucumber, which is basically a floppy belly on legs. Not really many legs, more kind of fibery, pointy things. And it's got a problem in that it needs to be floppy sometimes and it needs to be hard sometimes. And given the amount of comments I got on a YouTube video for saying this needs to be small, I can only imagine the innuendo I'm going to get for that one. But it has this problem in that it needs to get through small holes in the rocks, but it also needs to be tough to give itself as much protection as it can give. So it's got skin that can flip from being like a rubbery, kind of stretchy consistency to being as tough as the cartilage in the top of your ear, or cartilage anywhere else, but that's probably the easiest bit to feel. And it does that by switching on and off the bonds between the reinforcements in its skin. So if we just review that, when we're looking at animal shape change, we're looking at networks. We're looking at things that are related, things that slide across each other, things that turn bonds on and off. So we've got a couple of elements there to think about. We've got our plant swelling-based, and we've got our animal network and bond-based. And a really good, interesting material we've got that does some things like the animal shape change is shape memory polymers. So here I've got a sketch of that. And this basically works by having a network that's got 2 kinds of bonds. It's got one kind that's fixed, which we call the net points, and these might be chemical bonds, or they might be little crystals that hold the materials together. And it's got temporary bonds, which are here represented by the green triangles, and these might be like hydrogen bonds, or something else that's a little bit weaker. And basically, you put in some stimulus, usually that's heat, and then the weak bonds switch off, and you can pull them apart. And then if you hold it deformed, it will stay in that shape because the temporary bonds will kind of adapt to that new shape you've put it into. However, if you heat it up again, those other little bonds will just boop, cop out, and the network goes back to its original shape. And this is why we call it a shape memory polymer, because it's memorized the first shape that it's gone into. But you can take it into an intermediary shape with no problems, and it will just rest there until you put in more impetus. And this is where I kind of get onto the really interesting, what can we do with synthetic tech section of it. So you can mix shape memory polymers, and if they activate at different temperatures, when you make a blend of them, you get a blend that is activated at some temperature between the 2 temperatures of the different shape memory polymers. And this is work from Georgia Tech, and they use 2 plastics, one rubbery and one hard, and basically, they use different combinations of them, and depending on how much of the black polymer versus how much of the white polymer they've got, you get a temperature that's either closer to the black polymer or the white polymer. So they can program a sequence of folds. And here, at the bottom of the picture, I couldn't find a video, sorry, there's a little box that folds itself up. So it folds over one tab first, then the second tab, then it wraps up, then the final tab goes in. It's a self-assembling thing. It's printed on a commercially available 3D printer. The commercially available 3D printer is very expensive. I will get onto that later. Secondly, collapsing origami. So talking about our units, our bonds, our connected things that change their orientation. This is, I really hope I can get the video working for this. This is collapsing origami, which is based on Snapology origami. It's been around quite a while. And they've added a small pneumatic element so that this can be controlled remotely. And this thing is capable of flexing in all sorts of different ways. Can I play this? I wish there was someone here who could work Windows. Okay, I suggest everyone goes away and looks up that origami video because it's cool. I'm just going to try and play it. No, it doesn't seem to be doing it. Right, fine. I'm just going to give you extra description instead. That'll teach you. Plant-based swelling. So plant-based swelling, remember, we've got our general area that expands or contracts, and we shape that by laying in cellulose at different angles. Well, this is work by Lewis at the Weiss Institute in Harvard, and they've got a swelling gel matrix with cellulose in it, and they 3D print it, and as it goes through the nozzle of the 3D printer, the cellulose aligns because of the effects of flow. And so as it traces it out, it leaves cellulose along the direction that it printed. So they've got a way of organizing the cellulose inside this expanding print in a very complicated manner. And what they do is these kind of sort of deformed grid-like shapes. And they've developed a mathematical model where they can take a curved surface and then back construct the shape of the grid they need to print in order to get this network to fold up into a lovely, convoluted, curved, gentle surface. So this is suggested for, there's a video on the internet. This is suggested for use in making tissue constructs, because we've got a major problem at the moment in that we can make stem cells just about. We can lay them out in a dish. But that is 2D, and you may have noticed that your organs are 3D. And the 3D is crucial to their function. But if we could print them in 2D and then get them to self-assemble into 3D, that would solve some of the problem. So this is kind of where I throw it open to you guys. I think there are many open problems in shape changing, and I think that hobbyists have done an awful lot to contribute to electronics, to contribute to 3D printing, just to name two examples. And I think this field is ripe for you guys to contribute. So I mentioned the 3D printing, and I mentioned that the printer that was used to do that shape memory polymer blend was incredibly expensive. It's $120,000, and that's the entry-level model. So if you wanted to replicate that, I think it's not beyond our skills to create an open source printer that is able to mix two filaments on the fly. On the top here, I've got an example of a print that's just done with straightforward PLA. That's shape change that's possible just with regular PLA and a few layers. There's possibility there without even developing any chemistry. Open source stereolithography would be really lovely. I know there's a few models there. I've got one here, but it would be really nice to get that going. And it would be nice to have more printing materials to work with. And you may be thinking, I'm not a chemist, this is totally not my thing. That is fine. Mechanical design or origami. So that catch mechanism I was talking about, the things that interdigitate, slide over each other, and then have a bond, could you make something that was like that modular origami? I mean, these designs are coming from people who are at home playing with origami. These are not people who have necessarily formal training. These are people from all backgrounds. Could we make something like chainmail meets Velcro, where it collapses and then hooks, and then when you heat it up, the hooks come back? Would that be a good way of changing volume and changing space? Could you use some idea like the Venus flytrap to get something that snapped really quickly? And on the right here is some work out of MIT that's a design element that uses a simple the simple aspect of cylinders and discs to convert a bending rod into a curve of a prescribed tightness and size by modulating the size of the cylinders. Or might you be a designer or a potential user? Can you think of a thing that would be really cool if you could change that shape? So this is MIT Media Lab, which I unashamedly love. And the top one is a photo of materials which have bonded to them a biofilm which contracts when it experiences moisture. So it's a fabric that opens up little vents when you're sweaty. I really like it. At the bottom, there's something that perhaps there's slightly less need for. It's a cup of tea that tells you when it's done. The leaf wilts. As a British person, I feel a little bit unsure about this, but I'm sure there may be other applications. Or, you know, are you like, well, people are trying to do this, but actually I don't think it will work at all unless you do it like this. Do you have requirements that you need? Or would you like to volunteer for some concept studies? So, as a wrap-up, I'm mentioning shape-change materials. I'm working in shape-changing materials. I'm doing a blue sky PhD on shape-changing materials because I genuinely think they have some potential to address the vast amount of waste we create, our massive energy debt, and a whole load of problems that we have facing us in the world at the moment. I know it's a start. I know it's very early on, but we need to be thinking about what options we might have available, and I think smart materials are going to be a really easy way to passively manage our energy use without having to actually sell people on it. So here's my contact details. There's my Twitter, and I've put these slides online if you want to look up the references and everything afterwards, or you may not want to, that's fine too. And these are the kind of people who are paying for me to do my PhD. Thank you. I can take questions if you like, or you can come and find me afterwards. Well, does anybody have a question?
Okay, just raise your hand. I'll bring the mic.
Thanks. The shape-changing polymers you were talking about, are they, commercially available?
The shifting what, sorry?
Polymers.
Yes. So polyurethane, which is one shape memory polymer, it's water responsive. You can buy that as NinjaFlex as a printable polymer. There are other ones which can be formed quite easily from biofilms. Paper has some of these properties for the moisture response. For the heat response, I don't know whether you guys would be able to get hold of them. They're fairly low grade for me in terms of chemical safety at uni, but I don't know whether these suppliers would sell to regular people. But you can certainly work with moisture responsive things at home, and also any thermosetting plastic will also do the job.
More or less answers my question. And for what it's worth, scientific suppliers normally have no problem selling to ordinary people.
We still have 7 minutes for questions, so if you have any, please raise your hand. If not, well...
So for the videos, you want to look up the Weiss Institute and the Origami and Cellulose, but if you just type in 4D printing or metamaterial, shape-changing metamaterial, you'll find most of that stuff. So unless we've got any more burning questions, then I think you can totally locate me around site at some point. Thank you, everybody.